Samantha adjusted the strap of her purse as she shuffled through the crowded subway station, her mind racing with the mental to-do list she had been juggling all morning. It was one of those days where everything seemed to happen at once. The kids had been unusually difficult. Her 7-year-old son, Liam, refused to wear the jacket she laid out for him, and her 3-year-old daughter, Emma, had a full meltdown over the fact that her favorite pink sippy cup was in the dishwasher. She had spilled coffee on her blouse and arrived late to work, only to find her boss waiting at her desk with a stack of files labeled urgent. By noon, the tension in her shoulders had turned into a dull, throbbing headache, but she powered through her tasks, determined to make it through the day. Samantha was no stranger to stress. Raising 2 young kids as a single mom was no easy feat. Her ex-husband had left years ago, claiming he wasn't ready for the responsibility, and she had learned to manage on her own. Her parents lived close by, but their involvement in her life was minimal, limited to the occasional holiday visit or short phone call. Still, she reassured herself that she was strong enough to handle whatever life threw her way. But today, her body had other plans. It started with a faint wave of dizziness as she reviewed a report at her desk. She blinked a few times, trying to refocus her vision, but the words on the page seemed to blur together. Taking a deep breath, she chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, she'd barely slept the night before, having stayed up late to finish laundry and prepare lunches for the kids. Minutes later, the dizziness returned, this time accompanied by a sharp pain in her chest. Samantha froze, her hand instinctively flying to her chest. The pain wasn't unbearable, but it was enough to make her sit back in her chair, her heart pounding. Was it just anxiety? She had experienced panic attacks before, but this felt different. The pain was real, physical, and growing worse by the second. "Are you okay?" her coworker Jenna asked, noticing the pale, clammy look on Samantha's face. I think I just need some water," Samantha stammered, standing up too quickly. The room spun and her knees buckled. Jenna rushed to her side, gripping her arm to steady her. "You don't look fine. Sit down. I'm calling an ambulance." "No, I'm fine," Samantha insisted weakly, but the words barely escaped her lips before her vision went dark, and she collapsed onto the office floor. When Samantha opened her eyes, she was lying on a stretcher in the back of an ambulance. The paramedics were asking her questions, but their voices sounded distant and muffled, like she was underwater. She tried to focus, but her head throbbed, and every breath felt like an effort. "Mom, you're going to be okay," one of the paramedics said. "We're taking you to the hospital now. Do you have any allergies we should know about?" She shook her head weakly, her mind still reeling. Her thoughts immediately turned to Liam and Emma. Who was going to pick them up from school? Who would take care of them if she had to stay in the hospital? Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Please, I need to make a call," she croaked, her voice barely audible. By the time Samantha arrived at the hospital, she was hooked up to monitors, and a flurry of nurses and doctors surrounded her. She learned that her condition was more serious than she had initially thought. The tests revealed that she had suffered a minor heart episode, likely brought on by stress, and would need surgery to address an underlying issue. "You're incredibly lucky this was caught early," the cardiologist explained. "But you'll need to stay in the hospital for at least a few days for the procedure and recovery. Do you have someone who can take care of your children?" Samantha nodded, though her stomach churned with uncertainty. She had no close friends nearby who could step in on such short notice, and while she hated the thought of depending on her parents, they were the only real option she had. Later that afternoon, after being moved to a hospital room, Samantha picked up her phone and dialed her mother's number. "Hello?" Her mother's familiar voice answered after a few rings. "Hi, Mom, it's me," Samantha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm in the hospital. I had a health scare earlier today, and the doctors say I need surgery. I'll be here for a few days, and I was wondering if you and Dad could watch Liam and Emma while I recover." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a brief moment Samantha allowed herself to hope that her mother would respond with compassion and understanding, but the reply shattered that illusion. "Oh, Samantha, I'm sorry to hear that," her mother said, her tone more polite than concerned. "But your father and I are leaving tomorrow for a trip to the Bahamas. We've been planning it for months, and everything's already booked. I'm sure you can figure something out, though." Samantha felt her heart sink. "Mom, this is serious. I don't have anyone else to ask. Can't you reschedule your trip? It's just a few days." "You know how expensive these things are, dear," her mother replied, sounding almost annoyed. "And besides, you've always managed on your own before. I'm sure you'll figure it out." The conversation ended with Samantha fighting back tears, her mother's indifference cutting deeper than she ever thought possible. As the evening wore on, Samantha made call after call, desperately trying to find someone to watch her kids. A coworker eventually agreed to pick them up from school and keep them overnight, but it was a temporary solution at best. Exhausted and emotionally drained, Samantha lay back in her hospital bed, staring at the sterile white ceiling. Her parents' refusal replayed in her mind like a broken record. How could they be so dismissive, so unwilling to help in her time of need? They had always been distant, but this felt like a new level of betrayal. For the first time in years, Samantha allowed herself to cry, not just for the situation she was in, but for the realization that she could no longer count on the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. And as she wiped away her tears, a quiet resolve began to take root. She didn't know how she would get through this yet, but one thing was clear: she was done relying on people who consistently let her down. From now on, she would focus on building a life and a support system that didn't leave her feeling so alone. Certainly, below is a detailed and extended version of the second chapter. Samantha returned home a few days later, her body weakened from surgery and her spirit weighed down by the events of the past week. Her friend, Karen, had stepped in to help with the kids while she was in the hospital, but Samantha hated feeling like a burden. Karen had her own family to take care of, and though she was gracious and kind, Samantha knew she couldn't lean on her indefinitely. The house was unusually quiet when she walked through the door. Liam and Emma were napping on the couch, worn out from their time away from home. Samantha stood in the doorway, watching them for a moment. A pang of guilt washed over her. Her kids were so young, so full of life, and they didn't deserve any of this chaos. She vowed to shield them from as much of the turmoil as possible, even if it meant pushing her own pain aside. But as she turned to put her keys on the counter, her phone buzzed. A notification from Facebook caught her eye, and her stomach churned when she saw the name her mother. Curious and already bracing herself for disappointment, Samantha opened the app. The first thing she saw was a photo her parents had posted earlier that day. They were lounging on a pristine white beach, their faces lit with carefree smiles as turquoise waves lapped at their feet. Samantha's chest tightened as she stared at the image. A flood of emotions surged through her: anger, hurt, betrayal. Just days ago, she had been lying in a hospital bed, scared and vulnerable, while they were preparing for this vacation. And now they were flaunting it as though nothing else in the world mattered. She tried to push the feelings down, but they bubbled to the surface, impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the trip, it was what the trip represented. It was the culmination of years of being treated like an afterthought, of being told, directly or indirectly, that her struggles didn't matter. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, Samantha sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, scrolling through her parents' social media posts. The more she read, the angrier she became. They hadn't mentioned her hospitalization at all. There wasn't a single acknowledgement of what she had been through or what she was still recovering from. Instead, their feed was filled with photos of cocktails, sunsets, and fancy dinners. She thought back to her childhood, searching for signs that their selfishness had always been there, and she found them, like fragments of a puzzle that suddenly came together. Her parents had never been the warm, nurturing type. They had provided for her, sure, they made sure there was food on the table, a roof over her head, and clothes on her back. But emotionally, they had been distant at best, dismissive at worst. When Samantha struggled with anxiety as a teenager, her mother had brushed it off, telling her she was too sensitive. When she had her first heartbreak, her father had laughed and said, "You'll get over it. Toughen up." When she became pregnant with Liam at 25, they had been anything but supportive. Her mother had scolded her for not being more careful, while her father had shaken his head and muttered something about how her life was ruined. They hadn't even attended Liam's first birthday party, citing a golf tournament they didn't want to miss. The pattern was clear: her needs, her feelings, her life had always come second to their convenience. And this time, it was no different. As the days passed, Samantha found herself growing more and more resentful. She tried to push it aside, telling herself she didn't need them, but the betrayal lingered like a thorn in her side. Every time she looked at her kids, she felt a mix of sadness and determination. She would never let them feel the way her parents made her feel. One evening, while cleaning up after dinner, she overheard Liam talking to Emma in the living room. "Do you think Grandma and Grandpa are coming to visit us soon?" Liam asked. "I don't know," Emma replied, her voice small. "Maybe they don't like us." Samantha's heart broke. She put down the dish she was holding and walked into the room, kneeling beside her children. "Hey," she said gently. "Grandma and Grandpa love you very much. They're just busy right now." It was a lie, but what else could she say? How could she explain to a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old that their grandparents had chosen a vacation over them? The breaking point came a week later, when her mother finally called. "Hi, sweetheart," her mother chirped, her voice as cheerful as ever. "We just got back from the Bahamas. You wouldn't believe how beautiful it was. The weather was perfect, and the food was to die for." Samantha bit her tongue, her grip tightening on the phone. "I'm glad you had a good time," she said, her voice strained. "And how are you, dear? Feeling better?" "I'm recovering," Samantha replied. "It's been difficult, but I'm managing." "Well, that's good to hear," her mother said, her tone breezy. "We were thinking we might stop by next weekend, if we're not too busy. The kids must miss us." The casualness of her words was too much. Samantha felt something inside her snap. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling, "do you even realize what I've been through? I was in the hospital, needing surgery, and you and Dad couldn't even be bothered to help. I had to rely on a friend to watch my kids because you decided your vacation was more important." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Samantha, we've done so much for you over the years," her mother said defensively. "You're an adult now. You can't expect us to drop everything every time you have a problem." "A problem?" Samantha repeated, her voice rising. "Mom, I could have died. I needed you, and you weren't there. Do you have any idea how that feels?" Her mother sighed. "I'm sorry you feel that way, but we can't put our lives on hold for you. We've earned our time to relax. You'll understand when you're older." Samantha hung up the phone without another word. That night, she sat in bed, staring at the ceiling. For years, she had told herself that her parents' behavior was normal, that she was overreacting, that she should just accept it. But now, the truth was impossible to ignore. They didn't see her as a daughter in need, they saw her as a burden. And as painful as it was, she realized it was time to let go of the illusion that they would ever change. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she was done chasing their approval. From now on, she would focus on the people who truly cared about her kids, her friends, and herself. For the first time in a long time, Samantha felt a sense of clarity. It wouldn't be easy, but she would find a way to move forward. She had to, for her sake, and for her children's. Here's the detailed version of Chapter 3, written in a continuous narrative. The days following Samantha's confrontation with her mother were a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal swirled inside her like a storm she couldn't escape. At times, she found herself replaying the phone call in her head, thinking of all the things she wished she had said. Other times, she felt an oppressive numbness, as though her body had grown tired of carrying so much pain. But life didn't wait for her to sort through her emotions. The demands of single motherhood didn't allow for much downtime. Between juggling work, school drop-offs, and making sure the bills were paid on time, Samantha barely had a moment to breathe. If she didn't know better, she might have thought her busyness was a blessing. It kept her mind occupied, at least for a while. Still, the wounds from her parents' abandonment were fresh, and every reminder of their absence seemed to sting. One evening, while scrolling through her phone, she came across another picture they'd posted. It was from the same Bahamas trip, a candid shot of the two of them laughing at some beachfront restaurant, her father holding a lobster tail, her mother sipping a brightly colored cocktail. The caption read, "We've worked hard all our lives, now it's time to enjoy what we've earned." Samantha put her phone down and closed her eyes, trying to will away the ache in her chest. She had spent so many years craving their approval, their attention, their love. And yet, here they were, celebrating their lives as if she and their grandchildren barely existed. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Samantha sat at the kitchen table, staring at a blank piece of paper. It was something her therapist had suggested months ago, long before this particular crisis. Write a letter you'll never send, the therapist had said. Get the feelings out, even if no one ever reads them. It might help you process. At the time, Samantha had dismissed the idea. Writing to people who had hurt her felt pointless. But now, with her emotions boiling over, she decided to give it a try. She picked up a pen and began to write. "Dear Mom and Dad," she started. The words came slowly at first, hesitant and careful. But as she continued, they began to pour out of her, raw and unfiltered. "I don't understand how you could turn your backs on me when I needed you the most. I've always tried to be a good daughter. I've always tried to make you proud. But it feels like no matter what I do, I'll never be enough for you. You've made it so clear that your own happiness matters more to you than mine or Liam's or Emma's. Do you even know what that does to a person? To be told, over and over again, that they're not worth the effort? That their struggles are an inconvenience? I'm tired of pretending that I'm okay with how you treat me. I'm tired of making excuses for you. I deserve better, and so do my kids. If you ever decide to be a real part of our lives, the door is open. But I won't keep chasing after you. I won't keep begging for the love and support that should have been unconditional. Samantha." She put the pen down and stared at the letter. Her hands were trembling, and tears blurred her vision, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. The weight on her chest had lessened, even if only slightly. The next day, Samantha woke up determined to move forward. She couldn't change her parents, but she could change how much power she gave them over her happiness. Her first step was setting boundaries. She decided not to reach out to her parents unless absolutely necessary. No more calls to check in, no more sending pictures of the kids in hopes of eliciting a response. If they wanted to be involved in her life, they would have to make the effort. But setting boundaries was easier said than done. A week later, her father called out of the blue. Samantha hesitated before answering, bracing herself for whatever might come next. "Hey, Sam," he said, his tone casual, as if nothing had happened. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. "That's good to hear. Your mother and I were talking, and we thought it might be nice to take the kids for a weekend. Give you a break, you know?" Samantha felt a surge of anger. A break? Where was this offer when she was lying in a hospital bed, terrified and alone? But she forced herself to stay calm. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully. "But right now I think it's best if we take some space. I need time to figure out what kind of relationship I want with you going forward." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When her father finally spoke, his voice was defensive. "What's that supposed to mean? We've always been there for you. Just because we couldn't drop everything this one time doesn't mean we don't care." Samantha took a deep breath, her grip tightening on the phone. "This wasn't just one time, Dad. It's been a pattern my whole life. And I'm not angry anymore, I'm just tired. I need to focus on what's best for me and the kids." Her father muttered something under his breath, but Samantha didn't ask him to repeat it. Instead, she ended the call, feeling both drained and oddly empowered. For the first time, she had spoken her truth without backing down. In the weeks that followed, Samantha began to shift her focus. She reached out to friends, reconnecting with people she had drifted away from over the years. She started attending a local single-parent support group, where she met others who understood the unique challenges she faced. One evening, she shared her story with the group, her voice shaking as she recounted her parents' refusal to help during her hospitalization. When she finished, a woman named Carla spoke up. "I went through something similar with my own family," Carla said. "It's hard to accept that the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally can let us down so deeply. But you're not alone, and you don't have to keep carrying that weight by yourself." Samantha felt tears well up in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude, of relief. For the first time, she felt like she was part of a community, a network of people who truly cared. By the end of the third chapter, Samantha was beginning to redefine what family meant to her. It wasn't about blood ties or shared DNA, it was about love, respect, and showing up for one another, even when it wasn't convenient. Her parents might never change, but she didn't need their approval to be happy. She had her kids, her friends, and herself, and that was enough. Certainly. Here is the detailed version of Chapter 4, where Samantha takes the final steps toward reclaiming her sense of self and finding peace, along with the resolution of the story. Months passed, and the steady rhythm of Samantha's life became something she could hold on to. Her mornings filled with work, her afternoons spent with her children, her evenings devoted to whatever was necessary to keep their home running smoothly. The pain of the past still lingered, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a sharp bite, but it was no longer the overwhelming force it had once been. She had learned, through the small daily victories and her own personal growth, that the love and support she craved didn't have to come from the people who had let her down. Samantha had come a long way from the fragile woman who had struggled to process the hurt her parents had caused. In fact, as time passed, she began to feel a quiet strength emerge within herself. She was no longer searching for validation from anyone. Her sense of self-worth had become independent of her parents' approval. The truth was simple. Though hard-earned, she had built a family of her own, a family made of love, kindness, and respect, and that was more than enough. The turning point came one Saturday morning when she received a message from her mother, a rare event in itself. Her mother hadn't reached out much since the phone call in which Samantha had set boundaries, and while Samantha hadn't expected an apology, she'd been surprised by the complete radio silence. The text message was brief, almost sterile. "Sam, we're coming to visit next weekend. We'd like to talk. Please let us know if this is okay with you." Samantha stared at the message for a long time. She knew the request was coming from a place of discomfort. Her parents weren't accustomed to being confronted with their own actions. They were more comfortable sweeping things under the rug, pretending as though nothing had ever happened. But this time, things were different. She had changed. In the past, she might have felt a pang of guilt at the idea of rejecting their attempt at reconciliation. She might have second-guessed herself, questioned whether she was being too harsh, too unforgiving. But not now. Instead of letting the old patterns of self-doubt creep in, Samantha stood tall both figuratively and literally. She had spent months building the strength to say no when necessary, and she wasn't going to give that up now. She took a deep breath, then typed her response. "I've thought a lot about this, and I believe that we need to have some space. It's not that I don't want to talk, but I need to be clear that I can't just return to the way things were. I've made a life for myself and my kids, and I need to know that you respect the boundaries I've set. If you want to be part of our lives, that's fine, but it needs to be on different terms. Let me know if you're ready to talk about that." With one final glance at the message, she hit send. It was the first time she had communicated so clearly with her parents. For the first time, she had demanded respect on her own terms. A few days passed with no reply. Samantha didn't chase them. She didn't second-guess herself. She kept moving forward, embracing her life and all the complexities that came with it. She knew that if they wanted to be part of her world, they would have to meet her where she was. The weekend rolled around, and to her surprise, her parents arrived on Saturday afternoon without calling ahead. The doorbell rang, and Samantha hesitated for only a moment before she opened it. Her mother and father stood there, looking as polished and put together as ever, though they had the unmistakable air of people who had been caught off guard. "Hello, Samantha," her mother said, forcing a smile. "We came as soon as we got your message." Samantha stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of them, her parents, the people who had shaped her life, who had defined what family meant to her for so long. But now, as she looked at them, she didn't feel the same pang of longing. Instead, she felt a kind of solemn curiosity, as though she was seeing them for the first time, stripped of all the expectations and illusions she had carried for years. "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside to let them through the door. They settled into the living room, and for a long moment no one spoke. Samantha could feel the tension in the air, thick with unspoken words, but she refused to break the silence. Her parents were the ones who had hurt her. They were the ones who had avoided accountability for so long. Finally, her father spoke. "We've been thinking," he began, his voice measured. "And we realized that we may have made some mistakes. We didn't understand how much we hurt you by not being there when you needed us." Samantha could feel her heart pounding, but she didn't interrupt. She didn't want to react too quickly. She needed to hear them out. "We're sorry for that," her mother added, her voice softer than it had ever been. "We didn't think it was such a big deal at the time. But we realize now that it was." Samantha sat back, absorbing the apology. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first time they had truly acknowledged her feelings. It was a start, and for her, that was enough. "I appreciate your apology," she said, her voice steady but measured. "But I need to be clear with you. It's not just about the trip or the hospital visit. It's about a pattern of behavior that I've lived with for years. You both showed me that I wasn't a priority, and that hurt. It's hard to unlearn that." Her parents were quiet for a moment, each of them processing her words. Finally, her father nodded slowly. "We understand that now, Sam," he said quietly. "We really do." Samantha looked at them, then glanced over at her children who were playing in the next room. She could hear their laughter, their carefree joy, and something inside her softened. "I've spent so long chasing after your approval," she said softly. "But I've realized something important. I don't need your approval anymore. I've built a life for myself. I've learned to love myself, to care for my kids, and to surround myself with people who value me." Her mother's eyes glistened with something that might have been regret. "We never meant to make you feel that way, Sam." "I know," Samantha replied. "But I can't keep waiting for you to change. I have to move forward, with or without you." There was a long silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding. Her parents hadn't been perfect, and neither had she, but they were all human. And for the first time, they were all speaking honestly. "We want to try," her mother said after a pause. "We really do. We want to be part of your life, if you'll let us." Samantha smiled, not out of obligation, but because she truly meant it. "I'm open to that. But it's on my terms. And it will take time." Her parents nodded. For the first time, they were speaking the same language. They were meeting her on her terms. The following months brought new challenges, but also new opportunities for growth. Samantha's relationship with her parents remained cautious but hopeful. They didn't see her every day, and there were times when the old wounds would surface, but she no longer carried the weight of needing them to be something they couldn't be. She had found peace, not through their validation, but through her own ability to stand strong in the face of adversity. She had rebuilt her family on her own terms, and that was all she needed. As she sat on the porch one evening, watching her children play in the yard, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. She wasn't waiting for anyone to rescue her, to fix her, to make things right. She had learned to be her own hero. And that, Samantha realized, was the greatest gift she could give herself and her children. In the end, Samantha's story wasn't one of reconciliation or dramatic closure. It wasn't about fixing broken relationships or waiting for her parents to become the people she needed them to be. It was about realizing that she didn't need anyone else's approval to live a fulfilling, authentic life. Her journey had been one of acceptance, accepting herself, accepting her past, and finding peace in the present. She was no longer defined by the people who had let her down, and that freedom was more than enough.